I'm Virginia Thompson, Vice President of Product Management at Integration Point, and this is your update for August 27, 2018. Last week was a busy one in the U.S. for importers to be keeping an eye on this activity, so I'm going to jump right in with the week's highlights. The public hearings on the third list of the Section 301 list was held on August 22nd. This third list was the big one, the $200 billion worth of Chinese goods being imported into the U.S., originally proposed at 10%, now possibly at 25%, and so these hearings were very popular and highly attended. Then on August 23rd, we saw the effective date of the second list of the Section 301, and the U.S. importers started paying 25% higher duty rates on 409 fully qualified tariff numbers, representing $16 billion worth of Chinese goods on that second list. The same date was also the effective date of an offsetting list of U.S. goods being imported into China, which also had a 25% duty rate that China had assessed on 333 tariff numbers of U.S. goods representing a wide range of commodities. And then finally on Friday, USTR published a Federal Register notice regarding the annual report on China's WTO commitments. The report was published on Friday, August 24th. Their comments will be due by September 19th, and the public hearing will be on October 3rd. So first, jumping into a little more detail on the current status of the Section 301. The hearing, as noted, was held on the August 21 and 22 and was very popularly attended. This, once again, is the very large list representing $200 billion worth of value being imported into the United States, and is over 9,500 HS numbers. So it's a very large number of HS numbers that would represent an impact to a very large number of U.S. importers. There's an open question at this point as to whether or not the proposed duty rate would be 10% or 25%. When the FRN was first published, it was proposed at 10%. But based on President Trump's recent direction to USTR, USTR is now looking at whether they might move it to 25%. At the hearing, a majority of the participants testified against the imposition of tariffs. However, some of the participants in the hearing, mostly manufacturers in the metals industries, did testify in favor. Some of the arguments that were in testifying against the imposition of the tariffs weren't just economic in nature. There were some other arguments. For example, that they were unable to find alternate sources for the products that they were importing from China outside of China, or that if they had to move their sourcing to other countries, that these importers in the United States would be unable to easily maintain compliance with other regulatory or security requirements, such as Lacey Act or CTPAT, because the importers have trusted relationships with these manufacturers. Another thing to take note of is the fact that the final comments on this third list of the Section 301 is due by September 6th. As of this afternoon, a little over 2,400 comments have been filed to date, so it's obviously a very popular list or issue out there, and so if your company is impacted, you might want to take note and get your comments in before September 6th. Secondly, as noted, the effective date for the second list went into effect last week as well, and so this is now impacting more importers than the first list might have. $16 billion worth of goods, 409 fully qualified numbers, and like the first list that went into effect on July 6th, 25% duty that importers were not paying previously. A few considerations for U.S. importers to be aware of. You might think, because the first list also went into effect at 25% duty, that this is sort of the same thing and you might not have to worry too much about this. But you do have to look at each list a little differently and be aware that there are some differences. Obviously, it's different products, and you may not have had any products on the first list, but perhaps you've got products, commodities, HS numbers that are on the second list. So you have to be aware of that and take a look at each list individually. You also have to think about other sort of individual impacts. For example, you might now have to file 3 HS numbers where you didn't have to on your products that were on the first list. Some importers, for example, are using Chapter 98, and now where you have your regular original HS number and the 99 number, and sometimes you're filing 98 as well, you may have 3 HS numbers that you're filing on a given declaration line. And maybe you didn't have that situation on the first list, and now you do on the second list. So you want to think about things like that. You should also be aware that the 99 number that you're filing on the second list is different than the 99 number that are required to file on the first list. So be aware of that. The 99 number that you need to file on the second 301 list is 9903-8802. And then finally, and this is very important for all U.S. importers who import out of China to be aware of, if all three lists end up going into effect, almost 55% of the entire tariff schedule will be affected from China, which means obviously importers need to start being proactive. If you're not already, you need to be thinking about what the impact is going to be to you financially and operationally, and start thinking about whether you need to make changes to your supply chain in order to prevent possible impact to your company. And then finally, as noted, China responded on August 23rd by putting in place a corresponding 25% duty on 333 tariff numbers that were meant to offset the 25% duty on the 409 tariff numbers. And these particular 333 tariff numbers represented a wide range of products across numerous HS numbers and chapters, including agriculture, metals, plastics, medical device, and actually quite a few number of other commodities as well. On Friday, as noted, USTR published a federal trade notice on the annual report to Congress. This is actually a notice and a process that they go through every year. But this year I think it's going to bring a little more attention than it usually does because of the Section 301 and 232 activity that's been going on over this past year. And what they basically do each year is that they have an obligation to publish a report that is presented to Congress in which they're required to assess China's compliance with their WTO commitments, because China is a member of the WTO, and USTR is asked to report to Congress how good a job China is doing in complying with their WTO commitments. And as part of preparing that report, they seek public comment to help them prepare on that. So what they have done in this FRN is they've asked for comments on how good a job China is doing, and those comments are due by September 19th, and then there'll be a public hearing on October 3rd at which participants can speak further on their thoughts on the matter. Specifically, they're soliciting feedback on these areas here: trading rights, import regulations, export regulations, internal policies affecting trade, intellectual property rights, services, rule of law issues, and other WTO commitments. The FRN does give a little more detail about each of these areas and specific information about how to submit your comments. And then finally, it's important to be aware that the Section 301 tariffs are not all that's going on in the world of trade. While news on NAFTA has been fairly quiet of late, there was an important announcement this morning that Mexico and U.S. have come to an agreement on some of the automotive rules of origin. And because talks have been continuing, albeit slowly, recently, and very importantly without Canada at the table for quite a number of weeks. But Mexico and the U.S. have been talking and have come to an agreement that they made an announcement on this morning. Some of the specifics about some of those rules of origin have to do with the more manufacturing being in high-wage factories. Specifically, the factories will be required to have a minimum wage of $16 per hour. There will also be a requirement of a higher percent of local steel, aluminum, and other car parts that will be required in order to meet the threshold of a good being qualifying. And some other interesting and slightly different rule of origin qualifying components in order for something to qualify for automotive. However, this doesn't mean that NAFTA is necessarily dead in the water. Congress obviously has to approve this agreement, and we still need to get Canada back at the table, because certainly Mexico in particular has expressed publicly in their statements that they feel that it's important to have Canada engaged in the negotiations. However, there have been a number of sticking points there. One of the biggest ones has been the fact that the U.S. has expressed a desire for what's called the sunset provision, which is where if after, and what the U.S. is looking for is if after 5 years there isn't a stated renegotiation to extend the agreement basically is ended. Canada is absolutely refusing to agree with that, and so that's been sort of a non-starter at this point, and that's one of the things that they're going to have to come to terms with in order to continue these negotiations along. One of the other demands that the U.S. has had out there is to have greater access to the Canadian dairy market. There's also a newer issue that's come up, which is the possible introduction of removing oil rules of origin off the negotiating table altogether. This has come up because of the recent Mexican presidential election, and the new incoming president-elect, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador's advisors have recommended that he consider introducing that. So there's still a lot going on in terms of the negotiations on NAFTA. So again, global trade, never a dull moment. At Integration Point, we continue to recommend to our clients that they stay on top of such quickly changing conditions in the countries where they're managing global trade. Our clients utilize a combination of our continually updated global trade content and GTM solutions to help manage these impacts as they arise as quickly and as effectively as possible. We'll continue to monitor these ongoing regulation changes as they take place, and we'll provide regular updates through our videos. As always, thanks for listening.